Hi Night Owls, Dr. Nighttime here. Before we get into the video proper, I'd like to give a brief preface. As you've noticed, this video is long. Really long. About an hour long. Fortunately, I'm not a particularly fast talker most of the time. And throughout most of this, I recommend you could probably watch this at double speed, maybe 1.5 times speed. Yeah, feel free. I recommend that you watch a sped up version of this. You'll probably still be able to catch everything. Second of all, you'll notice this video is not high quality. I am not a videographer. I did not study film at all. My father, Elijah Shalom, did, but I am not him. I don't have his skills. If you would like to share this, but wish that you had a better version, if you can make a better version or talk to someone who can make a better version, you 100% have my permission to. I'd love it if a higher quality version of these ideas got out there, but I'm limited to what I have and can do in a reasonable amount of time. And lastly, a message to some of my more mathematically inclined viewers. This video was intended to be accessible to a broad range of viewers. Some of the compromises in presentation that I had to make were oversimplifying some of the notation. Let's just say that, as I'm sure you've noticed when talking to people without much of a math background, when you're trying to talk about anything mathematical, it's hard to keep people's attention once the parentheses start showing up. So function notation and such won't really be showing up. For my more mathematically inclined audience, you know what I mean, and you'll know what I'm talking about when we get to that, and you'll be able to follow it. I had to oversimplify and abuse some of the notation in order to keep the attention of a wider range of viewers. Alright, that's all. And now enjoy the video proper. Thank you. Welcome back, Night Owls. This is Dr. Nighttime. Tonight, while I don't usually get into political issues on this channel, there is a growing issue that I think I need to talk about. To put it dramatically, because why not go for some drama? There are two great evils in our midst. One on the far right, and one on the far left. Now, you might be wondering, Dr. Nighttime, you're a mathematician. This is a math channel, not a philosophy channel. Why are you talking about this here, and what makes you qualified to even talk about this? I'll answer it this way. Yes, this seems more like a social justice issue than a mathematical issue. What if I told you that there was a mathematical definition of social justice? Now, before I get to the mathematical definition, let's go with the more colloquial definition. Social justice is a measure of how well what is happening in society matches what ought to happen in that society. And there are all sorts of opinions on what should and shouldn't be happening in society, right? And if you were hoping for some mathematical calculation to, say, given any society an exact calculation for what constitutes social justice, unfortunately, I don't have that. Perhaps some mathematician greater than I could come up with that, but you're stuck with me. Or I guess the rest of YouTube, though I'm not sure what you'd search. Alright, so if I can't give that calculation, then what am I doing here? Well, you can't give an exact calculation of perfectly what should ideally happen. There are some rules about what's off limits, so to speak. Some stuff is debatable, and using math, some stuff is not. And unfortunately, there are some political factions in the United States, at least, and I think in lots of other countries, but I'm here in the United States. I see what I can see in the United States. Some political factions which are trying to go outside of what is permissible. It's one thing for me to talk and talk and talk about what society should be like ideally. But what gives me enough authority to set any ground rules? Well, what if I told you that I'm not even really going to be the one setting the ground rules? You will, I think. The ground rules that I'm going to suggest here, which I am not the one who came up with these, by the way, but the ground rules that I was taught from various sources are ones that I highly doubt you'd actually object to. Those basic ground rules, right? Those truths so obvious, so self-evident, if you will, that you'd have to be nuts to debate them. In math, those are called axioms. And if you only worry about following the exact axioms without thinking too hard about what you can do with them, then you won't come to any meaningful conclusions, right? Where the math comes in is in starting with those axioms and seeing, well, what must be true by fulfilling those axioms. And those are called theorems. And here I'm going to present some basic axioms, a few less basic axioms. I really don't know why they don't make the standard basic list that I've seen again and again and again, and only I've seen presented as a basic list and then a less basic list, but everything on either list seems pretty obvious. And I'll start from those axioms and build up some theories. Okay, so these obvious things that no one in their right mind would object to, let's get to it. One, anything that makes life worse for absolutely everyone would be a bad idea. Any sort of debate about climate change, for example, is a debate around the extent to which climate change is actually happening and the extent to which it would be making life unpleasant. No one's actually saying, yes, climate change is an existential threat to the Earth, and that's a good thing. I don't think I'm stepping on anybody's toes by putting out this axiom, or again, I didn't come up with any of these. I did not come up with any of these. This is not me being brilliant. This is me talking about stuff that is textbook if you have the right textbooks for it. Anyway, second one. You can't play favorites. This is essentially the anti-racism clause for social justice or social welfare. Often these will be presented under the title social welfare rather than social justice, but looking back at this definition here, it's a measure of how well what is happening in society matches what ought to happen. As long, whatever you want to call this, whether you want to call it general well-being, welfare, or justice, my point is this is a good thing that we should try to aim for. Anyway, you can't play favorites, right? You can't say, oh, well, this would be nice as long as all the people who benefit most in society are, let's say, all white, but if they were a mix between black and white, we wouldn't like that, right? So you can't play favorites. And already looking at that, you can start to see where some of the extremists on one side of the American political spectrum, like if you really, really go into the depths, you can start to see one of the two great evils that I was referring to. Another basic axiom, when evaluating whether some change to society would be good or bad, you don't need to consider the effect on unaffected citizens. Right? We do this all the time in our discourse, well, those of us who engage in political discourse. If you're worried about whether I live in Hartford, whether a particular legislative change in Hartford would be a good idea or a bad idea, it doesn't make sense to bring up how this change would affect life in Tallahassee. It wouldn't. You just don't even discuss it. By the way, I should mention, so why all the time I'm talking about, well, what would change? If you're introducing a change to society, what would be an improvement? What would make it worse? Rather than just how do you calculate social justice or social welfare? Well, as I alluded to a few minutes ago, while we can't necessarily come up with an exact formula, just setting these rules for what would be a positive change, what would be a negative change. Those rules can serve as a set of guidelines for what would or wouldn't be a valid way of calculating stuff. And the last of the basic axioms, this comes from the concept in math called continuity, essentially that the social welfare has to be a continuous function of individual welfares. If you're not familiar with continuity, all that means in this case is if a change would only affect one person, and it would only barely affect that one person. We're talking about like earning an extra $1 per year, right? Something like that. That small. Then they can't have a drastic change on how much social justice or injustice you think there is. Right? It can affect it a little bit, definitely. But the point is that small individual changes correspond to small social changes. In fact, you could even argue that a substantial or sizable change for one individual could be viewed as negligible for the entire population. You could argue that, but it wouldn't work the other way around. All right. So now a few other axioms that I've seen presented as an addendum to those basic four. But again, I don't think I'm stepping on anyone's toes by bringing these up. The measure of social justice has to be real valued. For any of my audience with a math background, you probably know what that means. It means the output has to be a real number. What that means for my non-mathematically inclined audience, it means that if you were to ask the question, okay, we get it that this change is better or is worse, asking the question how much better or how much worse, that question needs to make sense to even ask, right? That you don't necessarily need to have a way of calculating it, or not off the top of your head, right? But it's somehow quantifiable in the abstract. Now, while you might not be able to put an exact number on it because of difficulties with these estimations, you'd have a sense of a little bit better versus a lot better, and it would intuitively mean what you would want it to mean. Next rule, suppose that you'd rather live in a just society than in an unjust society if you didn't know what your place in that society would be. This was a somewhat, I think the reason why this one appears as an extra axiom as opposed to the original is it was developed much later, right? The economist John Rawls, who discovered it, I'll be referencing him a bit. This was a major contribution that seemed to have more far-reaching effects than even he realized. Yeah, John Rawls was a 20th century mathematician. He called this idea the veil of ignorance, right? That you're, well, when you're judging, if you were to set up an ideal society, the best way to do it would be to ideally say, all right, suppose that I suddenly became a random one of the people in that society. I'd better feel comfortable knowing that I could be the greatest king in that society, or I could be the most unfortunate peasant in that society. And that if you think about it that way and realize all the different outcomes that you could be setting up for yourself, right? That hypothetical thought experiment, that's a good way to think about what's good for society. So, again, the basic axiom being you'd rather live in a just society than an unjust society, as long as you wouldn't know that you would be benefiting from injustice. And finally, the idea that it's worth it to take a slight risk for a large probability of a great reward. While yes, there are different opinions on risk analysis, the idea being if the probability of failure is small enough and the risk, the loss if you fail is small enough, and the benefit if you succeed is great enough, that is there's always such a worthwhile risk. If you think about that, you're saying like, well, yeah, of course, right? It doesn't ever. Yes, of course, it's an axiom. That goes for most of these. Well, all of these, hopefully. Yeah. So if you don't feel like I'm stepping on your toes or saying anything heretical or taking any major leaps of faith with any of those 7 ideas, assuming you're good with all that, then everything that comes after this can be viewed as essentially unquestionable. Everything after this will not be based on any assumptions. It will only be based on these 7 axioms that, by this point, I hope you took as given even before I suggested it, or once I brought it up and said, well, yeah, of course. So now that we have those axioms, let's start talking about some basic theorems. First is complete monotonicity. What if only one or a few people in a society benefit, but no one loses? Now, I will mention, for those of you familiar with social welfare and have studied it from a mathematical perspective, you'll notice that the very first axiom that I brought up is probably a little different from the version that may have appeared in your book, if you studied from a textbook. Often they will bring up that the rule should be if one or a few people benefit but nobody loses, that is that you have to view that as a good change. Now that I feel like I'd have a harder time convincing people of, because they'd say, well, that's going to introduce inequality. You instead, by starting with the cataclysms are bad idea, you can actually, and keeping the other axioms the same, you can actually prove this, and they end up being equivalent sets of axioms. You can swap this one out for the first one I had, and those sets of axioms will be achieved together. Each set of axiom will either be achieved or fail to be achieved under exactly the same circumstances. They're equivalent sets of axioms. Here I'll only prove it one way. I'll prove, given the axioms that we already talked about, proving this. So, suppose you've got your list of people in society, and you have your few that benefited, and everyone else was unaffected. Well, you use the indifference property, right, to say, okay, everyone who is unaffected will ignore you for the sake of this calculation, just for looking at, is this a good change or a bad change? Once you've done that, now, in your subset of society that's actually relevant, okay, now everybody gained. And so that has to be viewed as a good thing, right? Because to reverse it, now that's a mini cataclysm. And so that proves the theorem. We've proven our first theorem. Another one that could make some people feel uncomfortable, but again, if the discomfort comes only after working with the axioms, not discomfort with the axioms, then it's not the theorem itself that's the problem. And if something's making you uncomfortable, it's probably some preconceived notion that just doesn't really work once you actually start applying the math to it. So the theorem is, as you can see, equality, or trying to equalize things, is not a valid objective function. You might think, well, wait a minute, can't I try to make things more equal and also make things better overall? Well, what do we mean by objective function? That actually means something specific. The objective function is the quantity you're trying to optimize. If you're trying to optimize some combination of equality and other stuff, right, and life actually being good, you're trying to optimize that, well, then it's that particular combination that's the objective function. And there are some social welfare functions or social justice functions that can be used as objective functions that have some sense of equality in them, right? Some calculation involving Gini coefficients, which I won't be getting into, but you could factor it in. Now, the one thing you can't do is say, I'm going to try to make things more equal, no matter what. Because if you caught my hints from about a minute ago, where I start talking about, well, making things equal in conjunction with or versus making things better, What about an absolute cataclysm? What about a world-ending event? Equality would be achieved and would be absolutely awful and would violate our very first axiom. Another approach, or if you don't want to even think about nuclear warfare or nuclear winter or anything, if your version of equalizing is to equalize downwards so that everyone has been punished to the point of the unhappiest citizen, or matching the unhappiest citizen, think Harrison Bergeron and the handicapper general, if you read up on your Vonnegut. I should probably go a little more into that for those of you who haven't read that particular book. It's a fictional short story about a society where, to make everything more equal, everyone has to carry around massive weights so that no one is physically stronger than anyone else. And everyone has to put in these headphones that blast noises to distract you so that no one is really that much smarter than anyone else. Yeah, we don't want that. And the next theorem, and this is where we start to get into stepping on the toes of stuff that people are actually trying to advocate. The egalitarian alleged social justice function doesn't work. It doesn't satisfy those axioms that we had introduced before. Now, in some of my circles, the phrase egalitarian has been morphed to mean essentially feminist, equal representation of men and women. Those largely in my religious Jewish circles. That's not what egalitarian means. My sneaky suspicion is that back when some religious Jewish circles were becoming more feminist, they didn't want to use the word feminist because they didn't want to encounter the argument of, well, you're only bringing this up now because the will of the American people has drifted to being more feminist, and the will of God doesn't depend on the will of the American people. That's my suspicion about why the word egalitarian is used in those circles, and I realize that a number of people watching this will be from those circles. But what egalitarianism means is things being more equal. Right? Now, okay, so why am I saying that's a new theorem? Right? Didn't I just say that that doesn't work? Well, there was a particular function that actually satisfies the first four axioms, or those basic axioms, but not the remaining three. What if we said, side with the lower of two people, or less happy of two people, in a conflict of interest between them? Okay, how does that differ from the equalizing? Right? It sounds like we're equalizing. Well, notice I'm only talking about equalizing when there is a conflict of interest. To have a conflict of interest, you would need two or more choices where under those choices, at least one person would benefit and at least one person would lose out. So what if you restrict the idea of equalizing only to cases where there's an actual conflict of interest? Yeah. As I mentioned before, this actually follows the first four basic axioms, but we'll see it runs into trouble with some of the others. For one thing, you actually can't find a real valued social welfare function that follows that, or rather, you can't find a real valued social welfare function that satisfies this desire for egalitarianism. Specifically, when you ask, okay, we'll say that it's better, right? The question of how much better falls apart. And we can see that with this example. Suppose we had two affected people, right? And in situation alpha, if we were to let some random numbers be associated with, or some arbitrary numbers be associated with individual happiness or individual welfare, right? So bigger numbers would be better. suppose we just say A equals 1,000, B equals 10. I probably should have made those numbers bigger more realistically, because the conventional way of doing this is to say, well, what sort of monetary value could we associate with this? And if your net worth is the equivalent of only $10 or $1,000, or net worth or anything you have access to, right? If you have negative net worth, but you actually, a lot of that is on a loan that you're capable of paying off in terms of your day-to-day life. It's like you're able to have access to some amount of money, and your shelter is worth that amount. These would be really, really, really low numbers if measured in US dollars in the year 2023. So perhaps I should have picked bigger numbers, but, or maybe we'll say the currency isn't US dollars, but okay, if A is 1,000 and B is 10 under our first situation, and we want to compare that to some situation beta where A is 1,000 plus X for some X, and B goes down by some amount, 10 minus Y. We'll assume that both X and Y are positive numbers, right? According to the this egalitarian social welfare function, or social justice function, for any positive X and any positive Y, situation alpha has to be better than situation beta. But we run into trouble when we start asking how much better. Because compare situation alpha to situation gamma, where A gets the plus X and B doesn't lose out on anything. So we have to say that this is an improvement over situation alpha, right? And when we ask how much better, well, it's going to depend on how big X is. But okay, for a fixed X, the improvement from situation alpha to situation gamma is some positive number. Okay, now let's compare situation gamma to situation beta. Obviously, this has to be some amount worse, right? And that amount worse is going to depend on Y, right? Once you've determined what X is, right? It's still going to depend on Y. If Y is a lot that B is losing out, then it's a lot worse. If Y is a little, then it's a little bit worse. And because of the continuity argument, right, if Y is sufficiently small but still positive, right, you can always make Y small enough to have the detriment be arbitrarily small. And so for a fixed X, you can always find some Y such that situation gamma is better than situation alpha, and the detriment of going from gamma down to beta is not enough to to overcompensate for the benefit gained from going from situation alpha to situation gamma, right? You went up by a bit, who knows how much of a bit, but some amount. You can always find you can always imagine some small, minuscule detriment to person B, such that moving back down would barely be noticeable. What if you don't like the idea of the function needing to be real value? There's actually a stronger proof that gets a better result, or a stronger result that, in fact, when I was learning this academically, not only did they not teach this one, they specifically tried to lead us away from the result that this is good. Not lead us away from this line of thinking, right? They didn't say anything about this line of thinking. Stronger proof is actually based on John Rawls' idea of the veil of ignorance. Using this veil of ignorance, you can turn the question of social justice into a risk assessment question. Because now that you're thinking, well, let's imagine a society that I would be entering into, and there's randomness, and I'm taking the risks of possibly being an aristocrat, and possibly being a peasant, and possibly being somewhere in between. Now you've turned this abstract and somewhat modern question of social justice into one of risk analysis, and risk analysis has been very, very, very heavily studied. And now that we're talking about risk analysis, And the fact that it's been so heavily studied, that's why John Rawls' work on The Veil of Ignorance has such far-reaching implications and why it's such a big deal, even more so than he thought. He tried to think about it as, well, people tend to be risk-averse, and he actually tried to use this to promote more egalitarian, closer to socialist ideals. I think he might have been a socialist. I'd have to double check that. He certainly had heavy criticism of capitalism as it's expressed, as it manifested itself in the latter half of the 20th century. He was unable to comment on 21st century capitalism because he passed away around the year 2000. But he sure made some strong and often cited achievements and discoveries during his lifetime. Anyway, so once we're thinking about this as risk assessment, we can now use that seventh axiom that I haven't brought up yet. No reasonable person would avert risk to such a great extent, right? If you think about this example here, where you could say, all right, in this situation, would you rather, in the worst case, lose a little bit, and maybe only one person loses a little bit, or be able to gain a lot, right? That sort of extreme risk aversion, no reasonable person would view that as reasonable. And given modern approaches to risk assessment, this actually provides a strong argument for what's called the utilitarian social justice function. That is simply when you look at each person's happiness in society, yeah, you either add them up or average them together and use that as your measure of social justice. Bearing in mind that perhaps your own happiness doesn't just come from what you have, it can also come from your knowledge that things happen through a fair process. To get a little more philosophical and less mathematical, the train of thought that can lead to that is starting with the classic trolley problem. You've got the trolley, and it could just randomly run over 5 people, or you could force it to run over 1 person. Variant of that is you have 6 people in a hospital, each with a different failing organ, and you have the choice of whether or not to murder the receptionist and to distribute the organs to the patients. Variant of that is, well, why bring the receptionist into it? Have the patients draw lots, and whoever gets the black lot or the losing lot is the one who dies immediately. One dies so that the others may all live. Variant off of that is, well, okay, what if you give people the choice of whether or not to draw the lots? Suppose you've got 6 such people, 5 say to draw the lots, 1 does not. And after euthanizing the willing but unlucky patient and saving 4 of the remaining 5, the last one says, well, now that you've got this organ and nowhere else to put it, you wouldn't be doing any harm by giving it to me. And that makes a lot of people uncomfortable, right? Hey, this person's trying to cheat the system. And the way of reconciling that, of saying, hey, you're denying somebody something that would be benefiting that person without any detriment to anyone else after the fact, is to say there is detriment. The fact that you're trying to do this through illegitimate means is detrimental to the system, should be counted as a detriment, and weighing that against the benefits. So that's the train of thought there that says, okay, the way you can factor, one way of factoring fairness into utilitarian social justice is to say there is utility to fairness. Things being fair can be worth something on their own, just wouldn't have infinite value. Hi, Dr. Nighttime here. Pardon the brief interjection. Upon viewing my own recording before actually posting it, I realized that there is one point I need to clarify regarding that hypothetical situation with the 6 dying patients in the hospital, each with a different failing organ, and the option of drawing lots. The agreement was supposed to be you choose to be in one of 2 groups. Either you choose to be part of the group that draws lots, or not. If not, then you can't be an organ donor, but you also won't be an organ recipient, and you'll die in whatever due course, however long it takes for your failing whatever to kill you. Whereas if you are in the group that draws lots, one of those who opts to be in the group that draws lots, one of those will be euthanized and the others will be saved. I guess, unless only one person chooses to be in that group, in which case the whole thing is kind of pointless. But in the case that I was bringing up, right, suppose that 1 chose not to be in the group and 5 chose to be in the group. So again, in case it was unclear, that was the arrangement that I was talking about. All right, back to the original talk. In case you're wondering, okay, with this egalitarian alleged social justice function that I'm ripping apart here, and okay, that's how it would work with 2 people. In an appendix at the end, I'll talk about how you would extend that to multiple people. Having thoroughly ripped apart that approach, right, or that alleged social justice function, I don't feel like taking too much time, and I've already taken long enough. I don't feel like taking too much time discussing how you would extend it to multiple people when I'm saying the whole idea is malarkey anyway, but I'll include it at the end. We've got our axioms. We've got our theorems. Now, what does this actually mean outside the ivory tower of a classroom, right? Well, as I mentioned, you could use this to thoroughly reject some of the ideologies on both the far right and on the far left. For the far right, it's pretty straightforward. When we're talking about, for example, the people marching in Charlottesville with their explicitly racist ideologies, yeah, racism is wrong. Unfortunately, I feel like a lot of the people who disagree with that would disagree with just academia overall. But yeah, the closest you can come to a mathematical proof that racism is wrong, or even this like more localized racial favoritism of saying, well, each society should benefit its racial majority, right? And so saying, well, this is a white country, we should benefit our white people. Black countries should benefit black people. Yeah, no. That's not legitimate either. And I feel like I probably wouldn't have a very hard time convincing anyone within my social circles of that. Where I feel the implications of these theories might step on the toes of some of the people in my social circles is when we analyze the far left. A few examples of far left opinions that I've seen within the past couple months. We should not be defending shoplifting. The idea that this person is less privileged, therefore the laws shouldn't apply, that doesn't work. one particular case from about a month ago in England, where a black woman was accused of shoplifting, though she may have come in trying to return something and been denied the return and left with the thing that she came in with. I haven't seen anything conclusive about the details, but while that is debatable, one thing that is not debatable is Asian store owners, right? This was in an Asian store. It's not okay to argue that Asian store owners are somehow parasitic to black patrons. It's perfectly fine to own and run a store and sell things to people who enter the store looking to buy those things. Just because there's a money transfer from customer to store owner and the customer is black and the store owner is Asian, and you could argue that in London where this happened, Asians are more privileged than black people. No. I mean, yes, each of those little things is true, but that doesn't make it wrong for an Asian store owner to sell merchandise to black customers. When you're looking at, when you're trying to discuss what the tax structure should be, there's a lot that goes into it. An argument that does not work is, look, there is a wealth disparity. Therefore, we must not be taxing them enough, right? That on its own doesn't work, but I've seen it cited a lot. Racial disparities on standardized tests, right? That doesn't automatically mean that the tests are flawed. Now, there have been psychologists have done some studies in different sorts on different sorts of standardized tests, and if you can show that, well, this community tends to misinterpret this or that or the other, right? Okay, that implies that the tests are flawed, and you can try to fix the tests, right? But some of the notions that, well, it's wrong to rely on standardized testing as even an estimate because of racial disparities, no, that doesn't work. And more recently, and what prompted me to make this video now, the ethics of the Israel-Palestine conflict are not based on the military disparities. A significant, though, based on what I've seen, I wouldn't call it surprising, though a lot of my friends are surprised, but a number of people are trying to boil the Israel-Palestine conflict down to, well, this racial group is privileged over that racial group, right? You'd rather be a Jew in Israel than an Arab in Gaza. Therefore, Israel must be in the wrong. And no, that doesn't work. All right, so with all that, right, it's one thing for you to sit through however long I've been babbling about, and hear these arguments about, yes, in theory, these aren't good arguments. Now, I should stress, this doesn't necessarily mean that left-wing positions themselves are all wrong. It just means that, there's some high school or college student or somebody rattling off these positions of it, that, okay, you might be using a bad argument, right? You can't expect everyone to be an expert on everything. I'm not an expert on everything. I'm barely an expert on my field of expertise, math. But there are some valid arguments in favor of leftist positions. Well, I'll say, I won't necessarily say I'm supporting these particular positions. I'm just saying such arguments exist. On racial relations and affirmative action, you can talk about, well, looking at our better schools and our weaker schools, are there racial disparities between weaker schools and stronger schools? Right? Or are there educational disparities between the quality of education on predominantly white versus predominantly black versus predominantly Hispanic schools. And you can definitely say, if you can point to those disparities, it is a moral imperative on our society to fix those disparities and to bear in mind that when someone's performing at some level in a weaker school versus someone performing at the same level in a stronger school, if those two candidates are applying to the same college, it would be more reasonable to expect that someone from a weaker school would start performing better under a stronger college than someone from an already strong school now performing better, right? Those are things that, yes, you can bring up. And it's not just saying, oh, this group is less privileged, game over, right? No. Say something like that. On policing, no, it doesn't work to say, oh, well, police officers are privileged with respect to black people, therefore all police are in the wrong. But you can start talking about differences between rules that police departments follow and enforce versus how sheriff's offices behave. And whether or not it would make sense to try to have police departments in urban cities, like whether that would actually work, whether it would work to modify them to be more like rural sheriff's offices. It's a conversation that can happen. I'm not going to have that whole conversation here. I certainly don't know enough to say anything authoritative about it, but I'm just saying that those positions could be brought up. On economics, as I mentioned, John Rawls was, if not a socialist, then at least very critical of contemporary capitalism. And I've seen some debates between economists on the relative merits of capitalism versus socialism. They'll talk about what's true meritocracy, whether there's an employer class that is willing to bend the rules to have its descendants remain within the employer class. Right? Those are discussions that can and do happen. Again, I'm not qualified to lead any of those discussions, but I have listened to some of them, and yes, the discussions are happening. On gender identity, you can talk about various psychological factors, right? And you can talk about how, for a lot of people, it would feel really, really weird to be in a play and playing the role of someone the opposite gender. And that there's something psychological going on, right? You can talk about that sort of stuff. But what doesn't work is to just say, well, listen to this marginalized group because this group is marginalized and case closed. All I'm saying is that these deeper, more nuanced discussions need to happen. Unfortunately, you can also see, based on the level of detail that would need to go into having those discussions seriously, how tempting it is to rely on those privilege-based discussions or privilege-based arguments, because not everyone can mentally take in all at once all the nuances that go into any of these arguments and any of these debates. But you can pretty easily say, privilege, less privilege. And so it's awfully tempting to let people join your side based on a bad argument, but if you're going to do that, it is important to make sure that you work in the message that that's not all that's important. All right. So when you have people voicing these problematic positions, for these problematic reasons, and saying, why are you defending the oppressor, blah, blah, blah. When you have someone who clearly uses the one-dimensional logic of trying to make things more equal and that's it, reasonably, what can you do? So one of the ways that I'll phrase this issue and this phenomenon is point out that ideology borders on the legal definition of insanity. Maybe you don't want to I wouldn't recommend saying that exactly to the people you're trying to convince, but instead, bearing in mind that if we say insanity is actually not knowing the difference between right and wrong, well, an hour ago, you hadn't even seen the beginning of this video, unless you paused because I've been rambling for so long. And bear in mind, these ideas with those basic axioms and everything that came from that. Yeah, in all likelihood, the people voicing these extremist positions for these extremist reasons didn't know that either, right? An hour ago, you might not have even known. And I'd like to remind you that insanity is a defense. And so realistically, it means there's only so harsh you should really be. Perhaps the most harsh being, if you're going to tackle this head on and talk directly to people, yeah, reference that no, that is not a valid worldview. That's really the best you can reasonably do. What I'm guessing would be a lot more effective, though this starts to get a little bit away from my area of expertise. Probably better to cater your words to left of center or right of center if you're trying to talk people down from racism, right? That's a thing too. I'm not expecting most people in my social circle who would be viewing this to be in white supremacist spaces to begin with, but if you want to try to move people away from that, good. And I'd say it's probably better to get polarized but not extreme people, and to say, use that as an example of, you can have your overall positions, just don't be like those extreme people. And that can actually, as long as you've got that reminder of what not to be like, yeah, that can help. I definitely say, don't punish people too hard. As I indicated, insanity is a defense. And also, think twice before voicing positions that would back up the problematic viewpoint. Whichever political positions you want to support, go ahead, support them, but try not to use or communicate the logic of privileged versus underprivileged, therefore I can determine morality. You don't want that to get out of hand and have people thinking that they can use those arguments or use that logic on any case, right? So there probably is something. View it almost as the left-wing version, or if you're doing this for left-wing reasons, or if you're voicing left-wing positions, view it as the left-wing version of I'm not racist, but let's say, this isn't my logic, but here's another reason for supporting this position. If you do that, if you distance yourself from, if you say, no, it's not okay to use that sort of logic, but here's different logic that will lead to the same conclusion, that's perfectly fine, and that's probably really productive. All right. And with that, that's my best advice on how to deal with political extremists, and how to try to talk people down from being too politically extreme, and guide people towards more rational reasons for supporting whichever positions they do. with that, finally, okay, here's the appendix and getting into some more mathematical calculation, right? I've tried to stay away from most of the calculation because I know that most of the people, or a lot of the people in my social circles, aren't mathematicians, and I don't want to have, I don't want to make videos that would confuse my non-mathematician friends. But here, I said that I'd get into how you could apply the egalitarian, what I'll call the egalitarian alleged social justice function onto many people. Right? Suppose you've got 5 people in your society. Right? Here, the numbers I chose were more consistent with network. I'm not sure why I didn't pick bigger numbers for that other numerical example I gave. But here, suppose in your situation alpha, the value for A is 300,000, for B it's 200,000, C 150,000, D 100,000, E 50,000. And for situation beta, some of the people are better off than they were before, some worse off. Suppose you say A goes down to 225,000, B goes down to 49,900, C goes up to 400,000, D goes up to 150,000, E goes up to 80,000. And the question is, under the egalitarian alleged social justice function, where you can only talk about, or how you extend this, right? If you're only talking about conflicts of interest between 2 people, say you have someone better off and someone worse off, right? When you've got these 5 people and everyone's either going up or down, how do you untangle it? Well, first thing you can do is, you'll notice in situation alpha, I deliberately labeled the people so that they were in decreasing order of individual welfare. In situation beta, it's all out of order. So can you rearrange it? Can you rearrange situation beta to be in decreasing order? Yeah, of course you can. Remember the idea of symmetry, that you can't play favorites? Well, that goes beyond not being able to play favorites of one group, one racial group, one ethnic group, one gender group, whatever it is. It also means you can't play favorites with your individuals. There can't be any benefit to, or you can't have any preference versus, okay, let's say A is the one with the 400,000 instead of C. Let's say B is the one with 225,000 instead of A, etc., etc. So I'm just rearranging them, right? So we'll say that while we haven't established a preference between situations alpha and beta, we do know that situations beta and beta prime are equally good. All right. Next, let's mess between A and E. And we say, we're going to try to make this look as similar as we can to situation alpha. Yeah? So we are going to lower the individual welfare of our most benefited, or we're going to mess with whoever's in the highest position and the lowest positions. That now we clearly have one person who's better off, one person who's worse off. You'll notice I lowered A by 100,000 to match the situation for A. I raised E by 50. The important thing being, I raised it somewhat, and there's still some way to go before reaching E being 50,000. So A got worse, E got better, according to the egalitarian alleged social justice function. This is an improvement. Okay, so situation beta prime is better than situation beta prime, which is equal to situation beta. Okay, so from beta to beta double prime is an improvement. All right, now you do the same for lowering B to from 225,000 to 200,000 and increasing E a little bit more. Then you look, C actually already matches situation alpha. Right? But so we'll mention this beta triple prime is better than beta double prime, which we said was better than beta. Okay, so beta triple prime is better than beta. And lastly, if you were to compare situation beta triple prime to situation alpha, the only ones with differences would be in positions D and E, and both of them are better in situation alpha. So you get this chain of preference. Alpha is better than beta triple prime, which is better than beta double prime, which is better than beta prime, which is just as good as beta. And so you could, essentially, when you're extending this egalitarian alleged social justice function with many people, you look at which situation has the mildest worst case scenario, right? So you could also just look at the lowest number. In situation alpha, the lowest individual welfare is 50,000. In situation beta, the lowest individual welfare is 49,900. And just based off of that, according to the egalitarian unlimited social justice function, you'd say situation alpha has to be better than situation beta. But about half an hour ago, I showed that that entire approach is utter malarkey. So I'm not sure how much it's worth it to try to extend this approach to more than 2 people if we can't use it anyway. With that, thanks for sitting through this long video. And until next time, this is Dr. Nighttime wishing you a good night.